What led to the demise of Laurel Canyon's freewheeling society of sex and rock and roll? Imagine living in a dreamy place where you look out your window to see Jim Morrison riding his bike past the eucalyptus trees as you hear Joni Mitchell's guitar echoing through the hills while ducks swim in the pond in your backyard. David Crosby and Frank Zappa breeze by you at the local country store before you stop by your neighbour's house to enjoy a game of ping pong and a swim, because it's always a fun time over at the Monkees' house. It may sound like a dream, but it's actually just another day in Laurel Canyon, 1967. But then change creeps in when disturbing events take place, and the laid-back feeling dissolves into fear and hopelessness. So what happened to Laurel Canyon's famously thriving community, and can we ever recreate this joyful way of living? To figure that out, let's take a journey through how a freewheeling community of musicians came to be, what changed, and how it ended.
65, I was 17.
Laurel Canyon was a place that gave you the permission to ask who you were, to find out what this life held for you, and not be scrambling for some regimented job in a regimented society. Jackson Browne. Laurel Canyon is less about a place and more about an idea based on a community of friends and neighbours who support each other while living in a welcoming neighbourhood. Artistic people working to create something meaningful that they can contribute to society. In 1963, the folk scene of Greenwich Village had inspired some musicians to come to LA to get their own West Coast thing going, oftentimes at open mic night at the Troubadour, which was then considered an avant-garde cafe that featured folk music. A little scenic country town just up the hills in Laurel Canyon had cheap rent for about $70 a month, where a struggling musician could afford to live and make an easy 5-minute commute down to the Sunset Strip for gigs.
Take me for a trip upon your magic sword.
It was serene. It was beautiful, winding, hilly. It was like living in the country, but you were in the big city. Roger McGuinn, The Byrds. In 1965, the Byrds had a huge hit with Bob Dylan's Mr. Tambourine Man, and with that, Chris Hillman moved into his house at the top of Kirkwood in Laurel Canyon. Chris Hillman tells the Bluegrass Situation, "It was purely by accident that I'm up there one day by the country store and I run into a guy who had a place to rent. It was wonderful. It was up on this road overlooking the entire city of LA. You can imagine how beautiful it was at night, with all the lights on and everything." Shortly thereafter, David Crosby moved up there, and then Roger McGuinn. The Byrds were very early occupants of the area. People were living up there in the 40s and 50s, some actors and a lot of artists. It already had this reputation as a bohemian beatnik enclave. During this time, the Byrds are enjoying a laid-back life and success of their hits with Mr. Tambourine Man and Turn, 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 which inspires other musicians. You didn't move there because you were wealthy. You moved there because it was right in the middle of town. It was really cheap to live. Mark Volman, The Turtles. Another band who had a hit in 1965 was The Turtles with Happy Together. Mark Volman lived on Lookout Mountain when he gets a new roommate named Richie Furay of Buffalo Springfield. Shortly after Neil Young moves in on Kirkwood, the Byrds played at the Troubadour with rock-inspired folk music as pure folk had started to wane and become less popular. They became hugely influential on the sound at that time, and other musicians wanted to emulate that sound of folk rock harmonies, which would come to be known as the California sound. The Laurel Canyon music scene of harmonies eventually evolves into the introspective singer-songwriter genre. As 1966 rolls around, the Mamas and the Papas are enjoying a new hit that is soaking up radio play, California Dreamin'. Their album, If You Can Believe Your Eyes and Ears, is all over the place, and they are enjoying life on Lookout Mountain in Laurel Canyon. John and Michelle Phillips, along with Denny Doherty, are all living together. Mama Cass soon moves in nearby on Woodrow Wilson Drive. They are living in Laurel Canyon and are writing songs inspired by Laurel Canyon and about free love when Michelle and Denny sneak off together and begin having an affair. Writing songs about free love is one thing. People's feelings while in a relationship are another. John finds out about the fling and is livid, and so is Mama Cass, who is in love with Denny and believes that they will end up together eventually. The betrayal rocks the group and John and Denny move out. Michelle stays behind in the Lookout Mountain home while John and Denny move into another house nearby. While the guys are living it up with the groupies in their new home, John is dating a few girls and Michelle begins seeing Gene Clark of the Byrds. The band continues to perform gigs while John and Michelle are broken up. Then one night at a show, Gene comes to see Michelle perform, and it is too much for John. After they are done performing, John chases Michelle outside in a fit of rage and fires her from the band as revenge for her betrayal.
I ran off the stage, out the back door and into my car. But John was hot on my heels, and he grabbed me and he said, "You are fired. You are fired." And I said, "I don't think you really have the legal right to do that, John." He said, "You wait and see."
Michelle knows the only way back into the band is to beg John back and repair their marriage. So she swallows her pride and does just that, and gets back into the band and with John for the meantime. Another hot band of 1966, living up in Laurel Canyon on Wonderland Avenue and Kirkwood, was Love with Arthur Lee and Johnny Eccles. They were one of the bands looking to emulate the Byrds, and they also played at the Troubadour. They had a hit with My Little Red Book in 1966. Several members of Love were formerly in a band called Grassroots. Ironically, one of previous members of Grassroots will cross paths with Love and later become part of a group that committed some of the most notorious killings of Southern California that shook Laurel Canyon and the nation to its core. Stay tuned for more on that. It was a very small community of musicians and long-haired weirdos. Mickey Dolenz, the Monkees. The Monkees' Peter Tork and Mickey Dolenz lived in Laurel Canyon, with Peter Tork sharing a place with Stephen Stills on Shady Oak and Dolenz on Horseshoe Canyon Road. Stephen Stills goes to audition for a new television show about a struggling band trying to make it while playing music, akin to the Beatles, while getting themselves into some hilariously sticky situations. He is turned down for not being telegenic, and is asked if he knows any other musicians to send to the audition. He suggests his roommate for the role. Peter Tork auditions and gets the role of lovable dummy, a persona he had developed as a folk singer in Greenwich Village. Peter and Stephen would become fixtures of the Laurel Canyon scene. Peter became known as the local Laurel Canyon nudist. Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys lives nearby and is hanging around in Laurel Canyon at a friend's house after having massive hits first with his surfer songs and then on his 1966 masterpiece, Pet Sounds. Pet Sounds became an album the Beatles take notice of in 1966 as the Beach Boys became their true rivals. Many report that Brian would occasionally show up to Laurel Canyon gatherings wearing his bathrobe. Brian's neighbour Michelle Phillips remembers going over to Brian and Marilyn Wilson's home, and Brian had the place filled with sand. Michelle recalls, "And one day I went over there, and the whole living room was full of sand, and there was nothing in the living room but a Steinway and piano bench, and just all sand. And I looked at her and I said, 'What is going on?' She said, 'I know it's crazy, but he's writing some great songs.'" 1966 will prove to be a pivotal moment in music, in society, and in Laurel Canyon. You can hear the change in the music when you go from the Beach Boys to Buffalo Springfield in the same year. This is empirical evidence that society can and has turned on a dime. In May '66, the Beach Boys are singing about California girls. By December, Buffalo Springfield are singing about revolution. In one summer, the country changed. We were playing at the Whiskey A Go-Go and ended up being on a double bill with The Doors and with Love. Richie Furay, Buffalo Springfield. Now that Richie Furay is neighbours with Stephen Stills, another folk musician they are friends with, Neil Young, also ends up in Laurel Canyon. They form a new band they name Buffalo Springfield. With members of Buffalo Springfield living and working in Laurel Canyon, they write a song in 1966 after Stephen Stills sees the cops roughing up some teenagers down on Sunset Strip who are hanging out refusing to leave after the city's 10 p.m. curfew. As the Vietnam War is ramping up, many Laurel Canyon residents are near the draft age, and suddenly the prospect of leaving paradise to fight in a war begins to become a fear that creeps in, and the music begins to reflect that sentiment felt in the canyon and across the country.
There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right.
The Doors move into Laurel Canyon with Jim Morrison living next to the country store on Rothdale Trail with his girlfriend Pamela Corson. Robbie Krieger and John Densmore live on Lookout Mountain. Jim described Pam as his cosmic partner. Their relationship is a roller coaster moving quickly, from loving to explosive arguments, especially when Jim is drinking. Ray Manzarek confessed that he never knew another person who could so complement Morrison's bizarreness.
The dark red hair, the white soft skin. No.
The Doors are the house band at the Whiskey A Go-Go until they are signed by Elektra Records in 1966. Jim can often be seen around Laurel Canyon riding his bike or around the Canyon Country store he lives next to when not on the road. The Doors' self-titled album is released in January 1967. The band is avant-garde with a groundbreaking sound produced by Ray's innovative playing and abilities on organ-style keyboard instruments, combined with Jim's poetic lyrics and stage persona. They sound like nothing else before, evolving the psychedelic rock sound. Jim writes People Are Strange while sitting atop Laurel Canyon with other members of the Doors watching the sun come up. He writes Love Street, about Pam and the country canyon store where the creatures meet they live next door to. The Doors' first official photographer, Bobby Klein, tells The Guardian, "Jim and I were around the same age and we clicked intellectually. He and his girlfriend, Pam Corson, moved into a place next door to where my wife and I lived in Laurel Canyon. I remember one evening we spent together, smoking a load of hash and listening to a vinyl import of Sgt. Pepper. That was a great night. One night, Pam came over late, claiming Jim had tried to kill her. She said he had pushed her into the closet and set it on fire when he found out she had been sleeping with this phony prince who had supplied her with heroin. Jim hated heroin, so was maybe trying to scare her into going clean. She ended up staying with us for a few weeks." Klein later told the story to Oliver Stone one night at dinner, who put it in the Doors movie. Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention lived in a log cabin on Laurel Canyon Road for a brief time, but then due to it being a fire hazard and in decay, he moved over to Woodrow Wilson Drive. In 1966, Frank had a hit album, Freak Out, and then next up was Absolutely Free, establishing them as an innovative voice in rock. Pauline Butcher, in her book about her time working for and living at Zappa's from 1967 to 1971, describes Zappa as a workaholic who rarely left his house and had to be pulled away from his work to eat on Christmas Day. Frank's house was a revolving door of rock stars. Butcher describes the scene at Zappa's. Mick Jagger and Marianne Faithfull came several times, once to jam with Captain Beefheart and another to chat with Frank round the kitchen table about politics. Interestingly, Mick showed more knowledge of history and politics than Frank, who covered his gaps in knowledge well with droll ripostes. She continues, "Others who strolled in unannounced included Joni Mitchell and David Crosby, Eric Clapton, who rarely spoke, Stephen Stills of Buffalo Springfield, Peter Tork of the Monkees, Mama Cass, Roger Waters and David Gilmour, who nodded in appreciation when Frank played new recordings no matter how dire, and Rod Stewart and Jeff Beck, who one night demolished the kitchen with a food fight. All were much bigger stars than Frank, but still they made their homage-like visits and appeared to treat him with great reverence."
For a chump like me to you. Well,
Alice Cooper was playing one night at a party in LA after arriving in town from Phoenix when they cleared the entire place out with their white noise. The only person who was left at the end of the performance was Frank Zappa. They asked them, "What the hell was that?" "We were playing a big party in LA with the Doors, Buffalo Springfield, Love, all those great bands," Cooper said. "We came on next to last because we were the house band. Everybody in the audience was on acid, of course, grooving on Peace and Love, and then all of a sudden you hear us and there's these insanity-looking clowns on stage. We scared the hell out of these people. They were all on acid. We looked like we'd just come up out of the ground and we didn't mind a little violence on stage," added Cooper. "That audience couldn't get out of the room fast enough. It was like somebody yelled, 'Fire!' There were 3 people left standing, Frank Zappa, my manager Shep Gordon, and one of the GTOs. Frank said, 'Anybody that can clear a room that quick, I've got to sign.'" In 1968, George and Ringo of the Beatles come to hang out at Peter Tork's house and to jam. Peter tells Rolling Stone, "Yeah, they did with Steve Stills. Steve was there and he was embarrassed. He shook hands with George and kind of turned his back on him, the way shy guys will do. We all jammed, Stephen and George and Ringo, and I was on keyboards, and I don't remember who played bass. It was fabulous to hear Ringo play. My God, what a drummer. God, he was good, he was so solid, and the authority was astounding. I learned so much just by playing with him for 5 minutes. It was a wonderful experience. Peter Tork also describes Jimi Hendrix hanging out at his house. I lived north of the canyon. Really, it was in the foothills of the Santa Monica Mountains there, where Laurel Canyon comes down off of Laurel Terrace, on a little tiny street called Shady Oak. I think it had one other house on it. He would have seen the big house that I lived in Studio City. The Monkees had the TV show. This would have been 1967. That house had a swimming pool that had nobody overlooking it, so we could swim au naturel. Jimi came over a lot with Buddy Miles. Jimi came over from time to time, but more often came Buddy Miles. Peter Tork was one of the MCs at the Monterey Pop Festival and introduced some of the bands he hung out with Laurel Canyon, including Buffalo Springfield, Lou Rawls, Booker T, and the MGs. Tork describes the experience as, "It was just fabulous. It was one of the most wonderful things of my entire life."
I'm here to fulfill a function this particular time round, one which I revel in and glory in, that of introducing the next group, who are my favorites because of long-standing friendships with individuals, as well as I like the music. I'd like you to welcome now, with a great big fat round of applause, my favorite group, the Buffalo Springfield.
I remember when I first got here driving around up in the canyon with a good stereo. There were no sidewalks, there were no regimented lines, no one locked their doors. Joni Mitchell. In 1967, David Crosby wandered down to Florida, where he met Joni Mitchell. Crosby told the Tampa Bay Times about his first meeting with Mitchell. "I walked into a coffee house in Coconut Grove, and she was standing there singing those songs, and I just was gobsmacked. I fell for her immediately. It's a little like falling into a cement mixer. She's kind of a turbulent girl." Crosby invites Mitchell to California, specifically to his house in Laurel Canyon. Joni goes and he introduces her to the Laurel Canyon scene, and they begin dating for what she refers to as a summer romance. At a get-together at Mama Cass's house, Joni Mitchell, David Crosby, Eric Clapton, Mickey Dolenz hang out and play outside in her backyard. Eric Clapton sat spellbound on the lawn as Joni playing Urge for Going, a song inspired by the death of the folk movement. Crosby was at her side, a joint in his mouth and a Cheshire Cat smile of satisfaction on his face, remembers screenwriter Carl Gottlieb, who was there. Mama Cass organised a little backyard barbecue because she'd met Cream. She invited Clapton, who was very quiet and almost painfully shy. And Joni Mitchell was there and doing her famous open tunings, and Eric sat and stared at her hands to try and figure out what she was doing. Cass's daughter Owen is sitting in the foreground. The romance ended, according to Crosby, when Joni found out he had gone back to a previous girlfriend, and she wrote a song about the situation and decided to unveil it for all at a party at Peter Tork's house in front of him. Crosby explained the moment to Howard Stern, and then she sang it again in case I didn't get it the first time. Unbelievable. Everybody in the room was going, "Oh, it's hysterically funny." Despite the breakup, Crosby produced Joni Mitchell's first album, Song to a Seagull. The Laurel Canyon scene inspired several of Joni's songs, but the most notable being Ladies of the Canyon. That must have healed her wounds because Joni soon fell in love with Graham Nash, who had met her at a performance in Ottawa. Joni Mitchell recalled the magic of Laurel Canyon. "My dining room looked out over Frank Zappa's duck pond, and once when my mother was visiting, 3 naked girls were floating around on a raft in the pond. In the upper hills, the Buffalo Springfield were playing, and in the afternoon there was just a cacophony of young bands rehearsing. At night, it was quiet except for cats and mockingbirds. It had a smell of eucalyptus, and in the spring, which was the rainy season then, a lot of wildflowers would spring up. Laurel Canyon had a wonderful, distinctive smell to it." Graham Nash was feeling bored and uninspired with the catchy 3-minute pop songs he was churning out with the Hollies. Before meeting Joni, Mama Cass took him to a party in Laurel Canyon. He was looking to go in a different direction around the time he came to Laurel Canyon. Joni and Graham meet at a performance in Ottawa. Nash described it as a seduction scene extraordinaire. He later recalled, "She picked up a guitar and played me 15 of the best songs I'd ever heard, and then we spent the night together. It was magical on so many different levels." They soon fell in love, and he came to stay with her in Laurel Canyon. He immediately left his band, the Hollies and England, and moved into her Laurel Canyon bungalow. Nash later described it as a beautiful bubble of creativity and friendship and sex and drugs and music. Although they arrived at Laurel Canyon at different times and had success with other bands, it was at a dinner party at Mama Cass's when one of the greatest bands of the era was born. They each have different accounts of how they first harmonized together, but one thing is for sure: when David Crosby, Stephen Stills and Graham Nash put their voices and accents together, it became something unique, something special. Nash said of the harmonies, "Whatever sound Crosby, Stills and Nash has was born in 30 seconds. That's how long it took us to harmonize." Soon Stephen's old bandmate from Buffalo, Springfield, Neil Young, would join, bringing his guitar abilities to the harmonies, and Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young would be one of the most loved sounds to come out of Laurel Canyon. It was at his home with Joni Mitchell that Graham Nash wrote his song of domesticated bliss, Our House. He recalls the day they spent at breakfast and then antique shopping before heading back to their home in Laurel Canyon, when he sat at the piano and wrote the song while Joni picked the flowers from outside for the new vase she bought. Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young's first major public gig was on August 16, 1969, at the Auditorium Theatre in Chicago, with Joni Mitchell as their opening act. They mentioned they were going to some place called Woodstock the next day, but that they had no idea where it was. Their one-hour show at the Woodstock Festival in the early morning of August 18, 1969, was a baptism by fire.
I'm lonely. I am yours. You are mine. You are...
Graham tells Goldmine when speaking of CSNYs and songwriting, "You never know how you're doing. You write a song like Teach Your Children and figure, well, that's a pretty little song, but I must tell you the first time that I ever played it for Stephen Stills. After I finished the song, he looked at me and said, 'That's a really good song. Don't ever play it like that again. You sound like Henry VIII. He played my song back to me with that beautiful right-hand picking style that Stephen is so well known for, and obviously he turned my Henry VIII song into something special." Joni ends her relationship with Graham Nash after leaving for Europe, partly due to their bickering, sending him a telegraph. "If you hold sand too tightly in your hand, it will run through your fingers. Love, Joan." That was the official end of their relationship. So after David Crosby departed the Byrds, another musician briefly joined and convinced them to try country music. That musician was country rock pioneer Graham Parsons. The album they recorded had a groundbreaking new country rock sound. Sweetheart of the Rodeo. They had a hit with Bob Dylan's song You Ain't Going Nowhere. Parsons' mission to bring country music to young audiences leads him to form the Flying Burrito Brothers with fellow bandmate from the Byrds and Laurel Canyon resident Chris Hillman. 1969 brought great change to Laurel Canyon. The freewheeling residents experienced fear in the canyon for the first time. The band Love member Arthur Lee tells the story of coming home from touring when his old bandmate from the Grassroots, Bobby Beausoleil, is in his house waiting for him. Bobby tells him of this group he is hanging out with along with his girlfriend Sadie. He has with him. Their stay was brief. That August news breaks that 5 young people are brutally murdered a half-mile from Laurel Canyon. The murder includes pregnant actress Sharon Tate and 4 others, as well as Tate's unborn baby. Tate's blood is used to spell pig on the door by Sadie. The home was being rented by Roman Polanski, but was owned by the Byrds producer, Terry Melcher, who is believed to be the target as Charles Manson had once been there when Melcher was considering him for a record contract, but then rejected him. Many Laurel Canyon musicians had been to the house for parties on several occasions. Just one day later, 2 more people are brutally murdered in a nearby Los Angeles neighborhood. The Manson family murders included both Bobby Beausoleil and his girlfriend Sadie, who had visited Arthur Lee in Laurel Canyon. The murders changed the vibe in Laurel Canyon and scared everyone. They locked their doors for the first time and became suspicious of strangers. People began to move away. Hippies began to be viewed as dangerous, and people thought the drugs had finally damaged their brains beyond repair. December 6, 1969, the Altamont Free Concert in Northern California was intended to be the West Coast Woodstock. It was anything but. The Rolling Stones and the Grateful Dead organized the concert and naively hired the Hells Angels as security. The scene was ugly, violent, and trashy. Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, and the Flying Burrito Brothers were on the lineup from Laurel Canyon. The concert ended with 4 people dead, hundreds injured, and the Grateful Dead refused to play due to the violence. Rolling Stone reported, That's the way things went at Altamont, so badly that the Grateful Dead, the prime organisers and movers of the festival, didn't even get to play. That was the day the 60s died. The Manson murders in nearby Benedict Canyon in August had put an end to the open-door, free love policy that had allowed the magical intermingling of the 60s. Altamont nailed the door shut. The 1970s begin with the residents of Laurel Canyon complaining about the skippies they claimed were ruining the neighborhood. The LA Times reported, many of the buildings are occupied by youths the hillsiders call skippies because they skip out on everything, rent, jobs, education. They say they are a harder, tougher hippie element than the flower children who flocked to the hills before them. Property owners link the nomadic youths with the downward trend in the canyon and with the rash of brush fires and burglaries that swept the hillside last summer. Many residents who once boasted they never locked their doors now say they are fearful. The 60s musicians that outgrew Laurel Canyon left for bigger homes and more privacy. Others left when the 60s vibe faded away. However, several young musicians had moved into Laurel Canyon by the end of the 1960s, but they would not become known to the world until the 1970s. Jackson Browne lived in the downstairs laundry room of famous Columbia Records A&R man Billy James's Laurel Canyon home. Browne established himself as one of Laurel Canyon's preeminent songwriters, with classics like These Days, written when he was 16, Take It Easy, co-written with the Eagles' Glenn Frey, and Running on Empty. While they were still up-and-coming singer-songwriters, Glenn Frey and Jackson Browne were neighbours, and they lived so close to one another that one could hear the other working on new music. Browne described the scene as an amazing tribal life. Glenn Frey describes his coming to Laurel Canyon. My very first day in California, I drove up La Cienega to Sunset Boulevard, turned right, drove to Laurel Canyon, and the first person I saw standing on the porch at the Canyon store was David Crosby. He was dressed exactly the way he was on the second Byrds album, that cape and the flat wide-brimmed hat. He was standing there like a statue. And the second day I was in California, I met J.D. Souther. Glenn Frey and Don Henley lived in Laurel Canyon. Both lived on Ridpath Drive and were initially backup singers for Linda Ronstadt, who lived on Kirkwood. In 1971, while touring with her, they were also writing songs, and after the tour, they decided to go on their own as the Eagles. The first single and lead track, Take It Easy, was a song written by Frey with his then Laurel Canyon neighbour, Jackson Browne. Browne had written the majority of the song, up until the line, I'm standing on a corner in Winslow, Arizona, where he got stalled. Frey added the next line, It's a girl, my lord, in a flatbed Ford, and Browne carried on to finish the song. Linda Ronstadt was living in Laurel Canyon and playing at the Troubadour after she had hits first with the Stone Ponies, including the song Different Drum, written by Michael Nesmith of the Monkees. Then, as a solo artist with hits like I Fall to Pieces. She came off stage one night at the Troubadour when J.D. Souther asked her if she would cook him dinner. She said yes, and they ended up living together for a year and a half, recording some of her biggest songs he wrote, including Faithless Love, Simple Man, Simple Dream, and Prisoner in Disguise. While living in Laurel Canyon, Bonnie Raitt recorded and released her self-titled debut album with the hit Thank You, and then in 1971 with a Give It Up with the bluesy Love Me Like a Man, and in 1973, Angel from Montgomery. Her albums feature her trademark blend of blues, folk, and roots rock. James Taylor recorded his Sweet Baby James while living in Laurel Canyon. The introspective singer-songwriter vibe suited him well and propelled his career for decades. James Taylor, who encouraged Carole King to sing her own songs and also played on her album Tapestry, had a #1 hit with You've Got a Friend later in 1971. In 1973, Little Feat leader Lowell George had been playing with Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention when he was fired for a drug reference in a song. He didn't have far to travel to his residence in Laurel Canyon. Zappa helped get his band's record deal. They recorded the song Willin'. The first 2 albums received nearly universal critical acclaim. and Willin' became a standard, subsequently popularized by its inclusion on Linda Ronstadt's album Heart Like a Wheel. In 1973, they recorded their most popular album Dixie Chicken.
And I've been from Tucson to Tucumcari.
Carole King's Tapestry album was written when she was living in Laurel Canyon, and the album cover at the window with the cat was taken at her home there. The album won 4 Grammy Awards, including Album of the Year and Song of the Year. It was recorded with 2 other Laurel Canyon musicians, James Taylor and Joni Mitchell. The cover was taken at King's home at Appian Way in Laurel Canyon, with a barefoot Carole King seeming to perfectly exhibit the effortless vibe of the 60s and 70s of Laurel Canyon.
Long ago I reached for you and there you
There is not an album or song on the charts today that holds a candle to any of the music that came out the 60s and 70s Laurel Canyon eras. Today, Laurel Canyon is filled with multi-million-dollar homes struggling musicians cannot afford. A far cry from the cheap rent that was paid in 1965, when musicians began to fill the bungalows tucked away in the hillside. It begs the question, if excessive drugs and money had not entered the picture, could Laurel Canyon have continued on as a supportive community of musicians? Or is it just the natural flow of society that everything must come to an end? Joni Mitchell found a book that began, "Ask anyone in America where the craziest people live and they'll tell you California." Ask anyone in California where the craziest people live and they'll say Los Angeles. Ask anyone in Los Angeles where the craziest people live and they'll tell you Hollywood. Ask anyone in Hollywood where the craziest people live and they'll say Laurel Canyon. And ask anyone in Laurel Canyon where the craziest people live and they'll say Lookout Mountain. So I bought a house on Lookout Mountain.